with me to Oklahoma's gaming frenzy in search of video games, game consoles, and basically everything else. This was such an awesome game convention. It was small, compact, but the community was great there. So let's talk about everything I ended up finding. Starting off, I stopped at Minty Tim's booth where he had a ton of Game Boy stuff. There was some really amazing stuff in this case. When I told him I was looking for Game Boy stuff, he pulled this case out and showed me. But then he also had another case over here. As you can see, he had GameCube stuff, a Virtual Boy. There was some amazing stuff here. Another case right here with games. As I said, there was some really good stuff that was definitely worth picking up, and I did grab a few Game Boy games here that were definitely well worth picking up. Then I made my way to this booth that ended up having Blood Will Tell, which is a game I'd love to own, but it's just so expensive, I probably won't get it anytime soon. There was a ton of awesome stuff on this table. Even the Zelda Game Boy was absolutely crazy. But then I saw this rack filled with box games. There was Game Boy games, Game Boy Advance games, Super Nintendo games, even Sega Genesis. This rack had a ton of awesome stuff on it. I even found a complete copy of Super Mario Land, which was wild, but I continued on where I made it to this vendor who recognized me, and so I started doing some little deals here. I ended up trading a Super Mario World for a game that he had. He ended up kind of wandering through his area trying to figure out what game was worth trading for, and we made it to the Xbox 360 game, and he ended up trading me this Lego Lord of the Rings copy, which was pretty cool and definitely an awesome thing to trade for. And if you notice, I will be trading a bunch of Super Mario Worlds at this convention, so you will see that in the future here. I went to this next booth and he had a bunch of cool stuff, but honestly, there was nothing I really had to buy. There was a ton of cool things like those boxes or some of the games here on this table. And then I made my way over here and I ended up finding a bunch of Game Boy games, but honestly, none of these Game Boy games were on my list. So at this point, I was kind of ready to see if he was interested in trading. We talked a little bit and he was. And so we kind of went back and forth here. He was saying, okay, what are you looking for? And I told him he's picking basically. So he came around and started looking at his game collection, or I guess what he was selling, and ended up trading me Sonic 3D Blast for it, which was totally awesome and definitely a cool thing. This guy was cool to talk to and definitely awesome. Then I continued on. I think this might have been either his booth or the booth right next to him, but these discs were pretty cool. And then this booth had a bunch of like consoles and hardware more like, and some Pokemon stuff, but I wasn't really looking for the Pokemon stuff there, as well as a ton of Sega 32X games, which was cool to see, as well as Master System games up there, and even a bunch of games here in bags, which were really, really nicely put together. I talked to him and said, hey, that NES is pretty smoky, and we talked, it's pretty yellow, and then I said, hey, what are you interested in trading Super Mario World for? And he kind of was like, okay, let me think. And he said, what do you think about trading for hardware? And then he pointed, got this mischievous look on his face and pointed to the NES that was super duper yellowed, and honestly, it was a decent trade. He was wanting to not have to take it back home with him, but he was also trying to trade me like the accessories and the hardware, and I was like, I can't take all of that for this, so let's just do the console for the game. And we did it. Then I moved on to this next booth that had a ton of awesome stuff here. There's a ton of Nintendo 64 things here, even a few like Switch things here and there, as well as a bunch of boxed NES games, which are always cool to see. And then we had a ton of handhelds here. That Pokeball 2DS is totally awesome. I'm so glad I had one of those. And then I kind of noticed there was a few bins up in front, and right on top was Rock Band 4 Complete for the Xbox. And I said, hey, you know this is worth more than $3? And he was like, oh, well, I don't really know. And so he said he picked this up on a lot, so he just threw it down there. And I said, it's worth more than that. So I ended up paying $10 for it, which I feel is more than fair. It's probably worth like 15 to 25 depending on who it is. But then I ended up finding this Hori controller, which was totally awesome, and I was so glad that I found it in this bin. As well as he had a whole bin filled with just cases and artwork. This ended up being like $3 for Mario Party 4, which was definitely worth it. And then I bought everything from him, and then I was like, hey, are you interested in trading? And he looked over to the Nintendo 64 section and ended up coming back with NBA Hang Time, which was a really good trade here. Both of these games are awesome, so that was definitely well worth it there. Then I continued on to my buddy Nick's booth, where he actually had a ton of awesome stuff here. He always brings a ton of stuff when I see him, so when he's at cons, I know I'm probably going to pick up at least something from him, but this booth was just ridiculously huge. There was a ton of games, a ton of consoles, and I basically made my way through his booth a little bit and checked out things here and there. But honestly, he probably has a ton of great stuff here that's definitely well worth it. I made my way to the Game Boy section here, where he had a bunch of Game Boy games and NES games right next to those. And then I kept walking, where I ended up finding these Nintendo Game Boy Minis. These things are just crazy. He had them still sealed, and I think he had them for $40, which is a really good deal. These things are pretty hard to find, especially complete in the box like that, which is pretty wild. Then Nick came over with this Star Wars Episode 1 handheld that I had previously said was really cool, and he ended up giving it to me. He had it marked for like $7, but he wasn't sure if it worked, so he just gave it to me, which was totally awesome, and I was so thankful that he did that. Nick's always doing great stuff like that, and I'm just so thankful for it. He also runs that Nostalgia Swap, or that comic book convention that I went to recently, so he always is doing cool stuff for the community, so it's great to see him out at places like this because he does so much. It's just one of those things that is awesome, but I kept walking through his booth. I wish I would have picked up this Charizard, but for whatever reason I didn't. Maybe next time I see him, I'll pick it up. But I did buy this Bulbasaur. So awesome. I'm so happy. This is a really cool looking Luigi. He looks really funny. I don't know what's up with him, but then I ended up finding this Game Boy Color that had a Pokemon on it that was pretty cool, that would switch if you moved the D-pad up. There was more stuff, Guitar Hero stuff, some TurboGrafx stuff. There was just a ton of awesome stuff, even sealed games here that Nick had. Definitely had some pretty cool stuff. And this clock was insane. I'll make my way back to Nick's booth later, but we continued on to this booth, which had a bunch of little kind of stuff, but nothing I absolutely had to have here. So I continued on to this booth, where I was interested in this Game Boy printer and the camera, but it was one of those things that was like maybe more of an extra than anything, as well as that cleaning cartridge, which was pretty cool. This glass case had some really decent stuff in it, but again, there was nothing here that I had to have, so I continued on pretty quickly after that to this next booth that had a bunch of PSP games that caught my eye while I was looking, and then I moved to the PS1 games, and then just kind of down at this booth there was some PS3 games. You can see some Wii games and PS2 games back in the back, but then they had a ton of good box games, whether it was Pokemon, Nintendo 64 stuff, SNES stuff, some really good stuff here, even some NES boxes, and then some cheaper boxes here, as well as a pretty solid GameCube collection. Now, I looked at this and was interested in some of this, but I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to spend the money or not. But I'm kind of glad that I didn't here, because you'll see I picked up some good GameCube stuff later on, but I did end up grabbing this Pokemon trading card game from them for the Game Boy, which is pretty cool. Then I made my way to the owner of this convention's booth named Eric Merce. He put it on, it was great. And I ended up finding this binder full of Game Boy games, which I flipped through for a while looking for things that I was interested in or had on my list. But honestly, the only thing that was there was Tetris, so I ended up grabbing that out of there. And then I kept searching through his booth. It took me a second to grab this Tetris, but once I grabbed it, I headed over to his booth and kept looking. He had a bunch of Super Mario Worlds, but they were in some rough condition. So I continued on where I looked through a ton of other games, like this NES spot right here. There was just a ton of games that were in this booth, so it was cool to see. I headed over to the GameCube section where I ended up grabbing Pikmin 2 and this Superman game. I think they were running like a 33% off sale, so when I ended up picking up these, I was definitely happy because I got a really great deal on these games. But that's not all I got here, so I ended up trading Eric for Super Mario World, as you could tell, and he ended up looking around and went to the Wii section and traded me Order Up, which looks totally awesome for the Wii. This game looks ridiculous, and I cannot wait to play it. But honestly, I'm really glad I stopped. It was a cool convention, and I'm glad that he put it on. He's putting out more, so check that out as well. I did see some really cool stuff at this next vendor that was still in the original seal, which was really cool to see. And then they just had tables and tables filled with box games for the NES, then the Super Nintendo, then the Nintendo 64, then a bunch of other things on this table at the end. This was a really good stop, but I didn't buy anything. Honestly, they had a ton of awesome stuff. So I continued on to this vendor who had a few video games, but was mostly like figures and other stuff. But I made my way to this Nintendo DS, which I ended up getting for $70 complete. The box was a bit beat up, but the console itself was in good condition, and this console with the box just looks totally awesome. I think I'm going to get a protective case for this thing, but I moved on to this next booth that had, again, a bunch of games here. This Bubble Bobble caught my eye, and I probably should have picked it up, but I didn't, as well as a Riffmaster. This is a cool guitar that I recently just got for myself, but I saw it and thought it was pretty cool. And then look at all this analog stuff down on the bottom shelf here, as well as that Nintendo 2DS that is Pikachu. Just some amazing games and consoles in those plastic cases. But then I saw all these Game Boys, and you know exactly where I went to. I saw Game Boy Micros that were pretty cool, but I did end up getting this see-through Game Boy Pocket, which was totally awesome. And then once I was done buying that, I said, hey, do you want to do a trade? And so he was definitely down to trade for Super Mario World. We were trying to find the best copy that I had in my backpack, and then he got to working and looking through his stuff. And since I just bought a Game Boy Pocket, he pulled out Miss Pac-Man and said, well, since you bought a Game Boy game, let's go ahead and trade Miss Pac-Man. So it was definitely well worth trading for, because I don't have that for the Game Boy, so definitely was awesome to trade with him. And then I made my way to the Gaming Horde booth, which this is a game store in my area that has some amazing stuff. Those are all sealed GameCube games, by the way. Absolutely insane. This booth was filled to the brim with video games. There was just so much to look at. I wandered through it and was kind of looking to see what I could pick up or what I may pick up. I didn't really end up actually buying anything here, which was kind of surprising to me, but it happens. Then I went to the front where I talked to the owner of the game store and this booth and said, hey, I got a game to trade for you. He wandered off and got Final Fantasy IX for the PlayStation 1. He tried to offer me a more expensive $60 game for the Super Nintendo. I couldn't take that from him, so I made him go back and find something else. And then I made my way to Arkansas Picker's booth. I ended up buying the Haunted Mansion for the GameCube. As you know, I'm still picking up GameCube games. And then I said, hey, I got another trade for you. We've done them before. And I had a whole bag full of Super Mario World. So he went ahead and pulled them out and was kind of looking to see what he could trade for here. And that is when he pulled out a PlayStation 2 game, which is Need for Speed Underground 2. This is an absolutely amazing game. Definitely well worth the trade. I am so glad this ended up being what he grabbed because it's an amazing game. If you've never played it, you definitely need to. Definitely well worth trading for. Then I kept hunting and kind of wandered through this next booth where they had a bunch of stuff here, but nothing I absolutely had to have, so I went to the booth right next to it, which had a bunch of NES, Nintendo 64 games, Super Nintendo games, even Wii U games, and this ended up being Big Money Bowman's booth. I've bought from him before, and then I bought from him at this con, so it was cool to kind of talk to him and get to know him a little bit there. There was a bunch of cool stuff here. I ended up bringing out Super Mario World and said, what are you interested in trading for? And when I did that, Arkansas Picture came over from his booth and started looking as well with him and was kind of being funny, like trying to find the most expensive game he could to trade for. But then Bowman actually brought out something crazy, which was definitely awesome and well worth the trade for me. And that happened to be Digimon Racing for the Game Boy Advance. This is so awesome. I've really been into the Game Boy Advance lately, so that is definitely a great trade. Then I made my way back to Minty Tim's booth. I kind of checked his booth out a little bit more now that I had a little bit more time since he was less busy. And I ended up finding some really good stuff. I ended up finding this Donkey Kong Land for the Game Boy, and then a Game Boy Pocket, the red one. This was definitely a good pickup from Minty Tim. And once I had bought these, I ended up saying, hey, I've got a bag full of Super Mario World. Are you interested in trading? And so we ended up finding the best copy that I had in my backpack, and he ended up looking around in his booth to try to find out what he would trade me for, and that's where he went to the Xbox 360 and the PS3 section, where he ended up grabbing Katamari Forever for the PS3. This is totally awesome. I love Katamari, and I don't have this for the PS3, so I'm so glad we made that deal there. It was definitely worth it and so great there. I'm so thankful that he ended up agreeing here. And when I made my way to Nick's booth again, I had already checked it out and I said, hey, I've got a bag full of Super Mario World. What are you interested in trading? And he knew right away what he wanted to trade. And he went back to the back of his booth and grabbed these Burger King Pokeballs with the Pokemon card in them. These were the gold ones, and it ended up being the Charizard one. This was such a crazy trade. I'm definitely so thankful for Nick. This was absolutely insane to me. I was not expecting this at all, but was definitely a great trade, and I'm so thankful. It's cool to see and meet people like Nick. We've met a few times, and it's always a pleasure, so I'm definitely glad there. And then I had 2 more games left, and so fittingly before I left the convention, I went to Arkansas Picker and said, what are you interested in trading for? And I ended up getting a Shrek game complete in the box. So there you have it. That was everything I ended up picking up from the Oklahoma Gaming Frenzy. It was a ton of stuff that I bought and traded for, and so there was definitely some stuff in there that I hadn't talked about before, so I wanted to just give you everything from the convention. It was totally amazing. Eric Mers put it on, and it was great. And also, it was sponsored by Got Games and the Gaming Horde, which are 2 local game stores. So that was definitely awesome. They just announced 2 more for 2025, so check out those dates if you're interested in going at all. But that was a ton of stuff. I had an amazing time talking to the vendors and getting to meet new people like Retro Rob. Everything about this convention was awesome. The community was great, so I'm definitely going to have to go there more in 2025. But I'm going to go get out of here because that was a ton of stuff, and I've got some games to play. So check out that video out right there. But I want to know what you think. What do you think about this convention? I know it was small, but it was small and awesome, so I'm really glad there. And also comment down below what you think was my best pickup from the day. But enough about that. I'm getting out of here, so check out that video out if you haven't already.